Every afternoon, around the time the sun began to lean westward and the shadows stretched long across the dirt road, I found myself standing near the front gate. I told myself it was only to check the fence or to see if the small patch of sunflowers needed water, but the truth was simpler and harder to admit. I was waiting. The town of Oakridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, yet large enough that a man could still feel invisible if he tried. I had gotten good at trying. My work kept me busy enough, copying contracts, drawing signs for the shops along the main street, sometimes helping the scribe at the town hall when his eyes grew tired. It was quiet work, the kind that let my hands move while my thoughts stayed still. After my wife passed, stillness had become something I both needed and feared. My daughter was 6 now. She had her mother's eyes and none of her caution. Every day she filled the small house with questions, drawings, and the kind of laughter that made the empty rooms feel less empty. I did my best for her. I cooked what I could remember her mother making, mended her clothes when they tore, and listened when she told me about the beetles she found or the neighbor's cat that stole fish. But there were nights when the house grew quiet and I realized how much space one person could leave behind. The sound I waited for was the soft chime of a bell tied to a harness. It came from the same direction every day, carried by a brown horse that knew the route better than most people knew their own street. The rider was tall, taller than most men in town, with green skin that caught the late light and turned it into something deeper. She wore a simple leather coat over a faded tunic, and her long dark hair was usually braided back to keep it out of her face while she rode. She carried the mail in a worn satchel across her shoulder. At first we only exchanged the necessary words. She would hand me whatever letters or notices had come. I would sign for them if needed, and she would continue down the road. But days turned into weeks, and the exchanges grew longer. She would ask about the sunflowers I had planted for my daughter. I would mention the rain that had turned the northern road into mud. She spoke of the different houses on her route, the ones where people waited at the gate the same way I did. I never asked why she had taken this work. She never asked why I stood outside even when there was no mail. My daughter learned the sound of the bell before I did. The moment it reached her, she would drop whatever she was doing and run to the gate, bare feet slapping against the wooden steps. She would greet the rider with the full force of her 6-year-old enthusiasm, telling her about the bug she caught that morning or how I had burned the porridge again. The rider never rushed her. She would dismount, crouch down to the child's height, and listen, as if every word mattered. She remembered small details, names of toys, favorite colors, the story about the cat that kept returning for fish. It was more patience than most adults showed. One afternoon, after the rider had handed me a small stack of letters and turned to leave, my daughter stood beside me at the gate and watched the horse and rider disappear around the bend. She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. Then she looked up at me with that serious expression she sometimes wore when she had figured something out ahead of the grown-ups. "Papa," she said, "the orc lady who brings the letters always smiles at you." I felt heat rise in my face before I could stop it. "She is friendly with everyone," I answered too quickly. "It is part of her work." My daughter shook her head, unconvinced. "No, she smiles at you longer. Her eyes get smaller when she does it, like this." She tried to demonstrate by squinting, which only made her look more determined than amused. I cleared my throat and turned back toward the house. "Go wash your hands before dinner." She did not move. "You change your shirt before she comes sometimes." "That is enough," I said, though my voice lacked any real weight. She followed me inside anyway, still talking. "And you stand outside even when there is no letter. You pretend to fix the fence, but the fence is already fixed." I did not answer. There was nothing safe to say. A child of 6 should not be able to see the things a man tried to keep hidden from himself. Yet she had named it plainly, the way children do, when they have not yet learned to lie to protect other people's comfort. That evening, after she had fallen asleep with her drawings scattered across the bed, I stood at the window and looked out at the empty road. The sun had already set. The bell would not ring again until tomorrow. I told myself I was only checking the latch on the gate. I told myself the quiet in the house was ordinary. Neither story felt true anymore. I'd spent 3 years building a life that asked very little of me. Work, the child, the small routines that kept the days from unraveling. It had been enough. Or I had convinced myself it was enough. Now a single observation from a 6-year-old had cracked something I had not realized was still whole enough to break. I did not know her name yet. She had never offered it, and I had never asked. She was simply the woman who brought the letters, the one my daughter ran to meet, the one whose smile I had started to notice longer than I should have. Tomorrow she would come again. I already knew I would be standing at the gate before the bell sounded. And for the first time in a long while, I was not sure whether I was waiting for the mail or for something else entirely. The days after that conversation with my daughter settled into a strange new rhythm. I went about my work as usual, copying contracts in the small room at the back of the house, mixing ink, sharpening quills, but I caught myself glancing toward the road more often than before. I told myself it was nothing. The afternoons were simply quieter now that I had started noticing them. My daughter, however, had clearly decided that quiet was no longer acceptable. One morning I found her in the garden, standing on her toes beside the cucumber vines. She had already picked 3 and was carefully examining a 4th, turning it in her small hands as if judging its character. When she saw me watching from the doorway, she held it up. "This one," she announced. "It's the nicest." I stepped outside. "What are you doing with the cucumbers?" She wiped the chosen one on her dress with great seriousness. "Giving it to the lady who brings the letters. She said her room doesn't get enough sun for growing things, so we can give her some of ours." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I had no memory of the writer ever mentioning her room or sunlight. My daughter, it seemed, remembered conversations I had barely registered. "She told you that?" I asked. My daughter nodded. "A long time ago. You were inside getting the letters signed." I watched her wrap the cucumber in a clean cloth and place it gently into a small basket she had taken from the kitchen. She added 2 more for good measure, then looked up at me with an expression far too strategic for someone who still needed help tying her shoes. "You can give it to her when she comes," she said. "I think you should be the one to give it," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. She smiled, small and knowing, and did not argue. That afternoon, the bell sounded earlier than usual. My daughter was already at the gate before I reached it, basket clutched in both hands. The rider slowed her horse and dismounted with the same quiet efficiency she always showed. She handed me a thin stack of letters first, then turned her attention to the small figure waiting impatiently at her feet. My daughter thrust the basket forward. "These are for you. Papa grew too many. He wanted you to have some." I felt the heat rise in my face before the rider even looked at me. "Mira." The rider accepted the basket. She studied the cucumbers for a moment, then lifted her gaze to mine. There was no mockery in her expression, only a quiet amusement that made the moment both better and worse. "Tell your father I am grateful," she said to my daughter, though her eyes remained on me. "These will be very welcome." My daughter turned and gave me a look of pure triumph. I cleared my throat and searched for something, anything, less awkward to say. "If you're not in a hurry," I heard myself offer, "there is lemon water with honey inside. It is cooling on days like this." The rider glanced at the road behind her, then back at the small house. For a moment I thought she would refuse. Then she gave a small nod. "I still have a few houses left on this route," she said, "but a small cup would be pleasant." My daughter made a sound that was dangerously close to a cheer and ran toward the house, leaving the 2 of us standing at the gate with the basket between us. We ended up beneath the narrow porch, where the shade was deepest. My daughter had insisted on bringing out 3 cups, though she drank hers so quickly she was soon fidgeting on the step between us, clearly waiting for an opportunity. The rider sat with her back straight, one hand resting on her knee, the other holding the cup as if it were something fragile. She looked larger here than she did on the horse, yet somehow less distant. My daughter lasted exactly 4 minutes before she spoke. "Do you like my papa?" The rider went very still. I nearly choked on the lemon water. "Mira," I managed, "that is not—" The rider raised a hand, not to silence me, but to answer anyway. She looked at my daughter with the same patient attention she always gave her. "Your father is a kind man," she said. "He speaks gently, even when he is tired. That is not common." My daughter tilted her head, unsatisfied. "So, you like him a little?" I stood up too quickly. "Go inside and bring the small cakes from the shelf. The ones we made yesterday." She went, but not without shooting me a look that said she knew exactly what I was doing. When the door closed behind her, the writer and I were left in a silence that felt heavier than it should have. "I am sorry," I said. "She is direct." "She is 6, the writer answered. 6-year-olds have not yet learned how to lie kindly. She took a slow sip of the lemon water. "It is not an unpleasant question." I did not know what to do with that answer, so I said nothing. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice quieter. "I grew up in a camp north of the old border. After the treaty, many of us were left without clear places. I did not want to stay where every morning began with the memory of what we had lost. Carrying letters seemed useful. People still need to hear from one another even when the world has changed." I looked at her hands. They were strong, marked by years of work, yet she held the cup with surprising care. "I copy contracts and draw signs," I said. "It is quiet work. After my wife died, quiet became easier than most things. Writing lets people keep what they cannot say out loud. I suppose that felt like enough for a while?" She nodded as if she understood something I had not quite said. My daughter returned with the plate of cakes, and the conversation shifted to safer ground. How the cucumbers were growing, whether the northern road would be passable after the recent rains. But something had changed in the space between us. When the writer finally stood to leave, she did not mount her horse immediately. She lingered at the gate for a few extra moments, adjusting the strap of her satchel longer than necessary. Over the next several days, she began to stay a little longer each time she came, not every afternoon, but often enough that my daughter started preparing reasons in advance. Fresh bread, a new drawing that needed showing, a question about whether letters from the capital ever arrived with wax seals. I never told her to stop. I told myself I was simply being polite. That was easier than admitting I had begun listening for the bell again, even on days when I knew there would be no mail. One evening, after the writer had gone and the house had grown quiet, my daughter sat on the floor with her chalks and drew 3 figures side by side. She did not ask me to look. She simply left the paper on the table when she went to bed. I studied it for a long time. The tallest figure had green skin and a long braid. The smallest figure stood in the middle, holding what looked like a basket of cucumbers. The third figure, the one on the left, had been drawn with careful attention to the way he stood near the gate, one hand resting on the post as if he had been waiting there for some time. I did not move the drawing. I left it on the table where the morning light would find it. And when I went to check the gate that night, I realized I was no longer pretending the fence needed mending. I was simply standing there, listening to the road, wondering how long it would be before the bell sounded again. The town held a small festival every spring called the Day of the Dove. It was not a grand affair, no parades, no music in the square, but it had its own quiet meaning. People wrote letters to those they cared about, simple blessings or thanks, and left them at the post for delivery. Children especially loved it. They would spend hours bent over paper, tongues between their teeth, trying to shape words that felt bigger than their hands. Mira had been unusually quiet for 2 days. I noticed her at the table after supper, hunched over a scrap of paper with a stub of charcoal. She kept one arm curled around it like a shield. When I asked what she was doing, she only said, "Nothing," in the tone that meant the opposite. I let her be. She was 6. Secrets at that age rarely lasted long anyway. On the afternoon of the festival, the bell rang at its usual time. Mira was already at the gate before I reached it, something clutched in her fist. The rider dismounted, handed me the day's letters, and turned toward my daughter with the same patient attention she always gave her. Mira held out a small folded paper tied with a piece of red string. "This is for you," she said. The rider took it, surprised. "For me?" Mira nodded. "But you have to read it right now, in front of Papa." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Mira, perhaps we should not—" The writer glanced at me, then back at the paper. She untied the string with careful fingers and opened it. Her eyes moved slowly across the uneven letters. I watched her face change. First confusion, then a slow, deep flush that climbed from her neck to the tips of her ears. She read aloud, her voice quiet. "Dear Miss Velra, my papa is very good but also very foolish. He likes you, but he is afraid to say so. Can you please come eat dinner with us? If you say yes, I will stop pretending to have a stomachache so papa has to come to the gate." The road seemed to go very still. Mira stood between us, rocking slightly on her heels, clearly pleased with herself. The writer looked at the paper for a long moment, then at me. I could not find words. My mouth had gone dry. "I am sorry," I managed at last. She should not have. Is it true? The writer asked. The question was simple. It landed like a stone in still water. I looked at my daughter. She was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Hope so open, it hurt to meet. I drew a slow breath. No, I said, it is not untrue. The writer's shoulders eased by the smallest fraction. She folded the letter again and slipped it into her coat. Then I will come, she said, after I finish the last houses. She mounted her horse and rode away without another word. Mira turned to me, eyes bright. I did it right, didn't I? I did not answer. I was still trying to remember how to breathe. She returned that evening as the light was fading. I had cooked rabbit stew, too much salt, not enough time, and set 3 bowls on the table. Mira had dragged an extra chair from the corner and was now sitting on it with her feet swinging, watching the door like a hawk. When the knock came, my hands felt clumsy. I opened the door. The writer stood there, no longer in her riding coat, wearing a simple dark tunic. She looked uncertain in a way I had not seen before. Come in, I said. The meal was quiet at first. Mira filled the silence with small stories. About a bird she had seen, about the way the stew smelled different tonight. The writer listened and answered when spoken to. I kept my eyes on my bowl more than was necessary. Halfway through, Mira set her spoon down. Papa cooked it special, she announced, because you were coming. I felt my face heat again. Mira. It is true, the writer said softly. She looked at me across the table. It tastes like care. I did not know what to do with kindness offered so plainly. I cleared my throat. It is only stew. She smiled, small and real. Sometimes that is enough. After we ate, Mira grew drowsy. She climbed into my lap without asking and fell asleep against my shoulder within minutes, one hand still curled around a crust of bread. The writer rose without being asked and helped me carry her to the small bed in the corner room. We stood together in the low light of the single candle while I pulled the blanket up to Mira's chin. She is brave, the writer said quietly. Braver than most grown people I know. She is also exhausting, I answered, though there was no heat in it. We returned to the main room. The fire had burned low. I added another small log and watched the flames catch. For a while, neither of us spoke. She misses having someone, I said at last. Not just me. Someone who stays. The writer sat on the bench across from me. Her hands rested on her knees. I have carried letters for 3 years, she said. I have seen many houses, some full of noise and children, some quiet like this one. I told myself the quiet suited me. She looked at the fire. Then I started noticing the way you waited at the gate even when there was nothing to wait for. I did not deny it. There was no point anymore. I am not good at this, I said, at wanting things again. It feels dangerous. Wanting is always dangerous, she answered. That does not make it wrong. Mira stirred in her sleep and murmured something I could not catch. The writer's expression softened as she watched her. Your daughter wrote that letter because she saw something you were still trying to hide from yourself, she said. I do not want to make either of your lives harder, but I also do not want to pretend I did not feel something when I read those crooked words. I met her eyes. In the firelight they were darker, warmer. I do not know what comes next, I said honestly. Neither do I, she replied, but perhaps we do not need to know tonight. We sat in silence after that. It was not uncomfortable. Mira's breathing was steady behind us. Outside, the road was empty and dark. For the first time in a long while, the quiet in the house did not feel like something I had to endure alone. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. Tomorrow, she said, I will come at the usual time. And perhaps I will stay a little longer after. I nodded. It was all I could manage. After she was gone, I sat by the dying fire and listened to my daughter sleep. The letter she had written still sat on the table where the writer had left it. I picked it up and read the uneven letters again. She had seen what I had refused to name. She had acted when I would not. I folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the small wooden box where I kept the few things that mattered. Then I went to the window and looked out at the empty road. For the first time, I was not afraid of what the bell might bring tomorrow. The rumors began 3 days after the dinner. I first heard them while delivering a set of copied contracts to the cloth merchant near the square. 2 women were speaking in low voices by the bolts of linen, and one of them glanced at me before quickly looking away. I caught only fragments. The widower, that orc woman, the child will grow up calling her mother. The words were not loud, but they carried the particular sharpness of things people believed they were not supposed to say out loud. I told myself it did not matter. Oakbridge was a small town. People talked. They had talked after my wife died, and they would talk again. Still, the back of my neck felt hot as I walked home. By the end of the week, the change in Velra was impossible to ignore. She still came each afternoon, the bell on Copper's harness announcing her arrival as always. But now she dismounted only long enough to hand me the letters. She no longer accepted the cup of water my daughter offered. She no longer asked about the sunflowers or the new drawing taped to the door. Her smile, when it appeared at all, was brief and careful, the kind people wear when they are already planning their next step away. My daughter noticed immediately. On the 5th evening, she sat on the floor with her chalk scattered around her and did not draw anything. She simply stared at the blank paper. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. I set down the quill I had been sharpening. "No." "She doesn't stay anymore. She used to stay." I had no answer that would not hurt one of us, so I said nothing. On the 6th day, I could not bear it any longer. After finishing my work, I walked to the small post station at the edge of town. The sun was low, painting the wooden building in long shadows. Copper stood tethered near the water trough, and Velra was brushing the horse's neck with slow, steady strokes. She did not turn when I approached. "Why are you avoiding us?" I asked. Her hand paused on the brush. For a moment she only breathed, the sound of it mixing with the creak of leather and the distant noise of the town settling for evening. "I am not avoiding," she said at last. "I am delivering the mail. You used to speak. You used to stay." She set the brush down and finally looked at me. Her eyes were tired in a way I had not seen before. "People are talking," she said. "They say the scribe has taken an interest in the orc who carries letters. They say it is not proper. They say your daughter will suffer for it." I felt anger rise, hot and useless. "Let them talk." "You do not understand what it is like," she answered, her voice low. "I have spent years learning how to move through human towns without drawing more attention than necessary. I know the looks. I know the doors that close a little faster when I approach. I will not be the reason your daughter learns to be ashamed of the people who care for her." "She is not ashamed," I said. "She is the one who wrote the letter." Velra's mouth tightened. "And that is exactly why I must stop. She is a child. She does not yet know how cruel the world can be to those who choose the wrong people." I stepped closer. "I like you, Velra. I have liked you for longer than I was willing to admit. My daughter saw it before I did. If you wish to stop because you do not feel the same, I will respect that. But do not leave because of what strangers whisper in the square." She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, the words came out rough. "I do feel the same," she said. "I have felt it since the first weeks, when you stood at the gate pretending to check a fence that did not need checking. I looked forward to that small, foolish hope in your eyes. But I am not a fool, Rowan. I know what it costs to keep hoping in a place that does not want us to." Hearing my name from her for the first time made something in my chest pull tight. "A difficult life is not as frightening as an empty one," I said. She looked at me as if I had spoken in a language she did not expect. Before either of us could say more, I heard the sound of small feet running across the packed earth. Mira appeared from behind the corner of the station, her face flushed and her hair coming loose from its ribbon. Behind her, at a more dignified distance, stood our elderly neighbor, the one who sometimes watched her when I had work in town. The woman gave me a small, apologetic nod and stayed back. Mira did not slow down. She ran straight to Velra and wrapped her arms around the tall woman's leg. "You're not making anything harder," my daughter said, her voice muffled against the leather of Velra's coat. "You make Papa smile. He didn't smile much before. Now he does, even when he burns the porridge." Velra stood very still. Then her hand, large and careful, came down to rest on Mira's head. Her shoulders began to shake. I moved without thinking and knelt on the other side of my daughter so that the three of us were close together in the fading light. "We will go slowly," I said. "We do not have to prove anything to anyone. If people talk, they talk. We will still eat dinner. We will still stand at the gate. That is enough. Valra's eyes were wet. She did not try to hide it. I do not know how to do this, she whispered. Neither do I answered. But we can learn. She nodded once, the movement small and trembling. When she finally straightened, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked down at Mira. Tomorrow, she said, I will come at the usual time, and I will stay for a little while after. If that is still what you both want? Mira nodded so hard her whole body moved. I rose to my feet. My knees ached from the hard ground, but I did not mind. Valra mounted Copper and rode away into the gathering dark. She did not look back, but something in the set of her shoulders had changed. It was no longer the posture of someone preparing to leave for good. That night, after Mira had fallen asleep, I sat at the table and looked at the blank space where her latest drawing usually lay. She had not drawn anything today. She had been too busy following me to the post station. I thought of the letter she had written weeks ago, now folded inside the wooden box with the few things I kept. It had been clumsy and honest and far braver than anything I had managed on my own. Outside the road was quiet. No bell rang. But for the first time in many days, I was not afraid of the silence. Tomorrow the bell would come again. And this time, when it did, I would not pretend I was only checking the fence. Months passed, and the house began to change in small, quiet ways. Valra came more often after finishing her route. Sometimes she stayed for dinner, sometimes only for a cup of tea while Mira showed her new drawings. She taught my daughter how to sit properly on Copper's back, guiding her small hands on the reins with surprising gentleness. I repaired the worn strap on her mail satchel one evening, sewing the leather with the same careful stitches I used on contracts. Mira started leaving an extra plate on the table without being asked. One afternoon, I found a new drawing on the table. 3 figures stood side by side beneath the sunflowers. The tallest had green skin and a long braid. The smallest stood in the middle, holding a basket. The third figure had one hand resting on the gatepost. Beneath them, in crooked letters, Mira had written, Our Home. I left the drawing where it was. One night, after Valra had gone and the fire had burned low, Mira sat on my lap and was quiet for a long time. She played with the edge of my sleeve. Papa, she said finally, if you marry Miss Valra, will Mama be sad? I held her closer. The question had been waiting for weeks. Your mother loved you very much, I said. She would want you to be loved. She would not want the house to stay empty just because she is no longer here. Mira was quiet again. Then she asked, Do you think she would like Miss Valra? I thought of my wife's quiet strength, the way she had always noticed when someone needed kindness without being asked. I think she would, I said. She would see that Miss Valra is good to you. That is what mattered most to her. Mira nodded slowly against my chest. Then I want her to stay, she whispered. The next day the dove arrived with clear skies and the smell of warm earth. I spent the morning writing at the small table in the back room. This time the letter was not from my daughter. I wrote it myself, crossing out lines and starting over until the words felt honest. That afternoon, I waited at the gate with the letter in my hand. When the bell sounded and Valra dismounted, I did not pretend I had been fixing anything. I simply held out the folded paper. She took it without speaking. Her eyes moved across the page. When she finished, she looked at me for a long moment. I knelt on the dirt road in front of her, something I had never imagined doing again. I wrote this myself, I said. No one helped me. You have brought letters to this house for a long time. Now I am asking you to bring something else. If you are willing, I would like you to stay. Not as the one who delivers the mail, but as the one I come home to, as my wife, as Mira's mother if she will have you. I opened my hand. A small silver ring rested in my palm, simple and unadorned. Valra Thornpost, I said, will you marry me? She did not answer at once. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and touched the ring. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. I was only supposed to deliver letters, she said, her voice unsteady. I did not plan to find a home. Neither did I answered. She nodded once, then again, more firmly. Yes, she said, I will stay. From behind the fence came a loud, triumphant shout. I knew it! Mira burst out from where she had been hiding, her face bright with victory. She ran straight to Valra and wrapped her arms around her waist. "I told you he would do it," she said to me, as if I had been the one who needed convincing. Valra laughed through her tears and lifted Mira off the ground. We were married in the yard 2 weeks later. There were no grand guests, only a few neighbors who chose to come, and the old priest who had known my wife. Lanterns hung from the sunflowers. Paper letters fluttered on strings between the posts. Mira wore her best dress and carried the small wooden box that held the first letter she had written. She stood between us during the short ceremony and announced loudly to everyone present that she had been the one to start everything. Valra bent down and kissed the top of her head. That night, after the last guest had left and the lanterns had been put out, I stood at the gate with my new wife. Mira was already asleep inside, exhausted from the day. The road was quiet, no bell rang. There was no mail to wait for. Valra leaned against the post beside me. "You used to stand here every afternoon," she said. "I did." "What were you waiting for?" I looked at her, at the green skin and the dark braid and the eyes that had once only passed me letters. "I did not know," I answered. "Now I do." She reached for my hand. Her fingers were warm and steady. Inside the house, our daughter slept with a new drawing beside her bed. 3 figures beneath the sunflowers. One small hand had written beneath them in careful, proud letters, "Our home." I no longer waited at the gate for the sound of a bell. The bell still came, of course. Valra still rode her route. But when she returned each evening, she came all the way inside. She hung her satchel by the door. She sat at our table. She answered when Mira called her name. And on the afternoons when the road was quiet, I sometimes still stood at the gate. Not because I was waiting for something to arrive, but because I finally understood what it meant to have something worth coming home to.